Now I know this doesn't look like a mini engine, but it does serve the purpose all the same. Basically, I put this picture in here so that you can see where the heat from burning the fuel goes. The best way to look at it is this: for every 100 gallons you put through a finely tuned engine, only 25 gallons of it will actually propel you down the road. And the object of the exercise is to try and improve on that. You can see that a lot of heat is lost out through the engine block. 35% of the heat generated in the cylinders goes out the exhaust, and 20%, a fifth of it, goes through the cooling system. Obviously, if we can bump that 25% at the output shaft to 30%, we'll have made a very substantial gain. The first thing that we need to do with any engine is to rectify one basic problem, and that is the worst impediment to producing power in any four-stroke conventional poppet valve engine is the valve itself. The valves are the worst impediment to flow. Now let's turn to the page where we got this deshrouding test. Now those of you who've got my A-series book will see that that's come out of there. This simple test here shows how it's important to make sure the valve is not excessively shrouded. Now obviously the bigger the bore of the engine, the larger valves we can get in. We're all aware that the A-series engine is a very long stroke motor. And that being the case, the breathing, getting good breathing becomes even more important because there's less valve to do it with. Now, the first step that I'm going to look at here is probably a route that most of you have gone at one time or another. You get a car, a Mini, and it's stock, and you don't want to get into a total rebuild on the engine, so you want to look at what you can bolt on to make it go better. Well, basically, that's what we're showing here. Essentially, the best bolt-on modifications for an A-series engine are those that tend to remove the weak spot, and that is the breathing of the cylinder head. So any time you approach a bolt-on program on your A-series engine, basically one of the first things you should do is to modify the cylinder head, and then work from there. Anything you then do to it will be more responsive. And obviously the carburetor can be a restriction, the air filter can be a restriction, the exhaust can be a restriction, but the prime restriction occurs at the valve, so it's always a cylinder head modifying program first. Now what I've got here is some fairly simple mods on an 850. I don't know how many of you got 850 minis. Those with 850 minis want to put their hands up? Yep, okay, there. I guess the rest of you got 1100s or 1275s. Yeah, well, the 850 mini is obviously most sorely in need of horsepower. And it's quite easy to increase the power output by some 50%. This is a demonstration here of what you can do with some fairly simple head modifications and improving the breathing capability of the filter system on it, which is in standard form is pretty bad. All that's been done here is it's got a K&N filter on, a different needle in the carburetor and a modified head, and basically the engine is producing between 30 and 50% more power everywhere in the rev range. So it now feels like you've just increased the capacity to about 1050 instead of 850. So that's a fairly easy way to go. I need you all to take a look at this filter. What I want you to do is hold it up to the light and look at the holes in it. Right? So if we can start that round, try not to hold on to it too long. Just hold it up to a bright light, look through the aperture there, and look at the holes in the filter. Now, I don't suppose that it's a really tremendous problem in this part of the world, but I know if you go inland, there's going to be a lot of dust in that. So air filtration becomes very important. A lot of people, when they're racing their cars, tend to miss out putting an air filter on because traditionally it was assumed that the air filter would restrict the engine and therefore it would cost you power. However, I have noticed that very few people ever consider how much power is lost by worn rings due to not having clean air. And an interesting experiment I did many years ago that convinced me that air filters were necessary even on a race engine was on a 1000 Mini engine that I was racing at Silverstone. I put an air filter on it. I made a large paper air filter. I weighed the air filter beforehand. I ran the car practicing the race and weighed it after. The interesting thing is that air filter collected over a teaspoonful of grit and rubber. Now when we looked at this, we washed it off with solvent and then collected. When we looked at this, we found that if you heated it up, it turned to a substance like grinding paste. So if I hadn't had that filter on the engine, it would have been about the same as putting a teaspoonful of grinding paste through the engine over a period of about 40 minutes. Now I'm sure that once you realize that's the kind of amount of dirt that can go through an engine on an asphalt racetrack in England in relatively damp conditions, you're unlikely to use your most expensive engine without an air filter. However, I'm sure you don't want to suffer a power drop. Well, the easiest way not to suffer a power drop is to use a highly efficient filter. And the best filter I've found from many, many tests is a K&N filter. Now, a lot of people rightly jump to the conclusion that it's just another filter. In actual fact, that proves not to be the case. K&N filter, when I first was confronted with it, provided me with a great number of problems. The first one was that up until the point I'd seen a K&N filter, I'd always used paper filters because I'd never found an aftermarket filter that would either filter or flow. If they filtered, they didn't flow. If they flowed, they didn't filter. What happened with the K&N was I arrived at the K&N booth on the SCORE show, which is a Southern California Off-Road Association, some years ago. I guess this would be about 1976. And talked to the boss at K&N, Kenny Johnson, and asked him how the filters flow. And he said, well, they flow real well. So I said, have you got any flow bench numbers? And he said, well, we don't have a flow bench. So I thought, well, that's strange. You can't really test it without a flow bench. So I said, well, I've got a flow bench. If you care to send me some filters, I will test them. Well, about 2 or 3 weeks later, I get a phone call from my guy in the workshop and said, there's a packing case here for you. So, how big is it? And he says, well, it's about 6 foot high by about 8 feet long by about 4 feet wide. I said, well, what the hell's that? He says, well, it says air filters on the outside. It's from K&N. So, I went down there, and it seems like they sent me one each of every filter. So I felt obliged to test some of them. So I went out and bought one each of every common filter that fitted a Chevrolet. Got down and tested the filters. Well, sure enough, the filters really flowed. They flowed much better than the best paper one. If you're going to use a paper one, by the way, the Motorcraft one is the best paper filter. It's a little more expensive than others, but if you have to buy a paper filter, go for the Motorcraft one. But basically the K&N one actually in terms of economics works out better because it's reusable and the paper one isn't. Now the next thing that happened was, having concluded that it flows better, I got into a debate with Kenny over the fact that he made this claim that the filter flowed better even when it had an 1/8 of an inch of dirt on it. So I said, wait a minute. With an 1/8 of an inch of dirt on it, it becomes the dirt that is the filtering element rather than the paper. And I said, for your filter to flow better than a paper one when it's dirty, it has to select the dirt that's going to go on it. And I don't think it's smart enough to do that. So he said, well, I don't know how it works, but that's what it does. So anyway, we got around to putting a pair of filters on a Baja pre-run vehicle. Did 500-mile pre-run around Baja. I took the filters off and I carried them back to Tucson, where I was living, from Riverside. A little bit of a problem. I'm carrying this, we had to suspend the filters in a box. And because they were loaded up with dirt, about an 1/8, 3/16 of an inch of dirt. Well, I'm carrying this box onto the airline. You can imagine the hassles I went through, right? I mean, they knew it was a bomb. Well, I finally got it to Tucson with a great deal of difficulty. Put it on the flow bench, and much to my amazement, this filter, with 3/16 of dirt on it, still outflowed a brand new Motorcraft paper filter. I now had a problem. I had no idea how it worked. Well, I thought about this for a while, and I figured finally that it was the electrostatic principle it worked on. And instead, everybody who's looked at it will realize it's got pretty big holes in it. But if you test it for its particle trapping capability, it'll trap down to microns. So the thing is how is it trapping down to microns with holes as large as it's got in it? So, you know, this is a problem that eventually I figure some reader would ask me, and I didn't have an answer for it. Well, first off, I thought it was electrostatic charge would build up on the grid. So, yeah, that figures. Because what happens, instead of the particle of dust going for the hole, as it does with a paper filter, it's going to go for the grid. The oil on it has basically a 2-volt static charge. As soon as the air started going through it, I figured, well, it's going to build the charge up. It could get as high as 20,000 volts. So several years went by, and I had an opportunity to test it on the dyno. We got a scope in and that. Ran an engine, made the connections, and by golly, there it was, 2 volts. So that blew that theory right out of the water. So now it's back, problem again. Several years went by. I was talking to a doctor friend of mine, and he provided the key for it. He said, you know, I was telling him this story, and he said, you know, I wonder if it works like lungs do. They got lots of little hairs on them. And I thought about that, and that's the way it does work. And the clue to it was that when it's tested on a static dust machine with steady flow, it doesn't filter quite as well as when it's on the engine. Pulsing flow on the engine is the difference. So, the conclusion I came to is that it's actually an active filter. And if you look at that filter under a microscope, you see that there's lots of little, like strands of cotton. And when the engine's drawing air through it and there's a pulsing flow, they vibrate like this. Right? Now, though there's plenty of holes between my fingers, you couldn't get anything between them because it's going to get, the movement of it it's sweeping the air and the particles get stuck on the grid. Hence, it doesn't clog the filter, but it still filters and you still get the high airflow. Anyway, that was the latest theory on it. So if anybody ever asks you how a K&N filter works, it's not filtering by what is known as just a mechanical tack barrier. It's actually an active filter which sweeps the air clean. And that's how that system works. Now this makes it, with the advent of this type of filter, it makes it no excuse for ever running a race engine without an air filter. Because now we can feed the engine clean air, which means the rings now survive indefinitely. The valve seats don't have to deal with particles dinging them and causing leaks there. So our expensive race engines can now be made to go far further. Anyway, any questions on K&N filters? I'm sure you know all about the fitting.
Problems with dust getting in between the housing and the filter itself?
Well, you can do if the casings aren't quite right, but you can get a grease to put around there, and that fixes that.
Is there one that'll fit on a 45 mm side drive motor?
Yes, there is. The range of filters made for Minis is extremely extensive, or any A-series engine, both for the SUs and Strombergs and Mikunis, Webers, Delortos, you name it. Downdraft ones, side draft ones, a whole lot are available. And they're all available with internal stacks in them so that you get good airflow into them. By the way, the K&Ns, they can't use this in advertising, but the K&N filters were used on the Honda Spirit engine. So if they figured it was good enough to protect their $250,000 engines, probably all right for a Mini.
How do you clean them?
You just spray inside and wash them out. You know, there's a K&N cleaner. You spray from the inside out and you wash it from the inside out. Otherwise you'll get dirt on the inside. But all those instructions come in the box. So, you know, that's an easy one to deal with. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that the bigger the hole underneath the valve, the more it must flow. Well, what I want to do here is to hopefully get rid of that misconception. let's look at a valve here which is being supported by a means other than the seat, and we have the hole underneath the valve exactly the same diameter as the seat. And you can see that air flowing out through here. It's got a sharp edge to flow over. Well, sharp edges don't make very streamlined exits. Even if we could make this practicality, it doesn't work very well. If we chamfer the corner, such as putting a small seat on, we find it improves it. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that the smallest chamfer is going to get the job done. On the other hand, if we go to a too large a chamfer, we're going to have too small a hole underneath the seat, and the result will be less high lift flow. For what it's worth, for most valves between about 1 inch and about 2.5 inches, a 60 thousandths wide seat flows best. If you make it thinner, flow goes down. If you make it wider, flow goes down. So basically that should solve a problem as to what seat width you should use. 60 thousandths is it, unless you want to spend a lot of time experimenting on a flow bench. Just stick to that number. Anyway, if chamfering the edge at 45 degrees improves the situation, it's not unreasonable to assume that putting a chamfer before and after that also improves the situation, which for the most part it does. So, if all these chamfers make it better, we could come to the conclusion that a radius would make it even better yet. Well, marginally it does. Only problem is we end up with a valve seat which is not conducive to flow. So this isn't practical. However, going to the next one, where we have a 45 degree seat and we use a radius to blend this area and this area, works. So we can conclude that this is a good way to go. Here it is, here with another addition. On the seat and the cylinder head here, we've got a radius before and after the seat. But on the seat on the valve, we've only got a radius before. So what we've done here is add a lip on the edge of the valve, which gives it a radius on the exit. This actually improves the flow. But we've now got a larger valve. We have to ask the question is, would it have been better to use a conventional valve that much bigger? And the answer is yes, it would have been. So this lip, although it works, is not actually a practicality, because if you've got room to get that in, you're better off putting the bigger valve in and using it in a conventional form. Now with minis, we pretty much use up all the valve space there is available, so this is totally academic, but it's worth mentioning that streamlining the exit of the valve does pay off. Now let's look at what happens in the corner of the chamber, because this is a pretty important area, very often overlooked. This radius here is important because it deflects the airflow around the side of the valve. It's important for two reasons, actually. One, airflow into the cylinder, and two, if there's a sharp corner here, the mixture that's there does not burn. So we've gone to all that trouble to get it in the cylinder, it's simply going to go back out unburned. By putting this radius in here, we make it more burnable. Now in most cases it doesn't cure the problem, it just lessens it. So anyway, this is what I've done here, and this is how I cut the seats on my heads, is that I make this a 15 degree angle from the seat. So this is 45, a small radius, or a 30, a very small 30, then 15 degrees into the wall here. And this drawing here shows it without the valve. You can probably see it more clearly. So anyway, the thing is, the point that I want to make there is that's step-by-step improving of valve seat designs. But one of the things that we really need to take care of on the intake valve is to stop exhaust going out the intake. And there are several ways you can do that. I mean, the anti-reversion valve that I designed with the groove in it is one way, but if you're using standard type valves, there's another easy way. What you do is you chamfer this top corner, cut it so that the margin here is very thin. So what happens is the air tends to go off in this direction, or the exhaust. If it tries to go around the valve, it has a very sharp corner to go around, so it tends to discourage reverse flow. So having a narrow margin can be a help in that respect. By stopping the exhaust going out the intake, you make the engine far less cammy. So you can put in a bigger cam and still have good driving manners. I have a little story here. My eldest daughter used to do a lot of racing and she often used to get asked by people, well, is the cam in your engine streetable? And she'd always tell them yes, and then of course sometime later they'd talk to me and say, well, I bought one of those cams and put it in my motor and it's son of a bitch to drive. And I said, well, who told you? He said, Sam did. And I said, it's no good asking her. I said, the first car she drove had a 320, this is what she learned to drive in, a 320-degree cam in it. If you let the clutch out under 6,000, the engine stalled. Right? And really, to get it to go off the line properly, you had to use 7. And the power band on this motor was from 7 to 10.5. And this is what she learned to drive in. Right? So somebody said, was it a streetable cam? She said, well, I drove it on the street, so it must be. So it was no good asking her what a street drivable cam is. So I'm just warning you in case any of you happen to talk to her, right? I'm sure if she asked her if a top fuel car was streetable, she'd say, yeah, if gas stations are close enough. Something new on cylinder heads for you to mull over here. As I said earlier, one of the big problems with the A-series engine is that it has small valves for a lot of displacement under it. Consequently, this eventually becomes a problem that starves the engine of air and limits the horsepower. Now, if you get everything right on the engine, an A-series engine can make foot-pounds of torque that will match almost any engine out there. And the interesting thing is the engines that we're doing in our shop will match torque in foot-pounds per cubic inch or foot-pounds per litre, equal to Warren Johnson's Pro Stock car. And I know that's a more expensive engine than a piece of cast iron we got from the wrecking yard and worked on. So they do have that potential. The unfortunate thing is it won't match it for horsepower per cubic inch. And that's because eventually the engine runs out of air. So now we're going to try and do something about that. If you get this page here, what you're looking at there is the typical areas of a valve opening envelope. You can see that there is more area above the half lift, more area below the half lift of the valve, breathing air below it, than there is above it. So this means that the valve spends more time in the low lift area. So it's a good idea to try and improve it there. Now, the tendency is when people are modifying cylinder heads, all they're buying one, is to ask the head modifier, well, how many CFM did it flow? So he quotes the big number, 150 at 600 lift. Great. I don't know if any of us have got 600 lift valve trains. So it gets to be a little academic. But how many of us ever ask, what kind of flow efficiencies are we seeing at 50 and 100,000s? Which is an important area because this is where the valve spends a lot of time. So what we're going to do here is we're going to try and make get some kind of idea of the relative importance of high lift flow and low lift flow, and the relative importance of the valve seat to the port. Most people, when they start porting a cylinder head, they go straight in and they grind on the ports. This is usually the straightest part, the most unobstructed part of the air passage to the engine. It's the one that needs the least amount of work to it. It's already probably straight. It's the corners that need fixing, and the worst corners are going around the edge of the valve. Now, if we look at this drawing here, which you all have, this is a technique we developed, which we can analyze the relative importance of the valve seat, and that's both on the valve and the cylinder head, and the port. Now, this particular test is off a small block Chevrolet. So with a Mini, it all happens at slightly lower valve lifts, but nonetheless not that low. If you look at this, you will see that the intake port doesn't overtake the importance of the valve seat until 400 thousandths lift. In other words, until 400 thousandths valve lift is seen at the valve seat, the shape of the valve seat, and getting it to work is more important than the port. Now, for a Mini, it's about 300 to 350 thousandths, depending on the size of the valve. There's a lot of engines out there that only lift the valves 350 thousandths. And yet, they'll almost inevitably have a lot of port work done, but very little attention paid to the seat. That's a basic mistake to avoid. Cutting the seat should not be an afterthought. Oh yeah, well, we'll put a seat on it about, yeah, this will do. That'll seal it up. That valve seat's the most important thing. Now, I know a lot of people go for very thin valve seats in the belief that they're getting a lot of area. It doesn't work that way, but we'll come to that in a while. Let's get on to something that's going to be a little different here. Turn to this drawing here. What it represents is 2 intake valves of a 4-valve head and 1 intake valve of a 2-valve head. Now, we are most often told that 4-valve engines work because they can get more valve area into the cylinder. That is only a very minor part of the story. In fact, it has almost nothing to do with it. On one particular engine that's available, commonly available, we have a selection of cylinder heads which range from a fairly mediocre 2-valve head to a very good 4-valve head. It is possible to run tests on this engine, it's a Pinto engine if anybody wants to know, with valve areas the same in both 2 and 4-valve configurations. And yet the 4-valve engine, even though we can get 2 cylinder heads which flow very similarly, the 4-valve engine makes more horsepower. Now, first off, you may say, well, it's got the spark plug in the middle of the cylinder, it's going to have better combustion. That's another fallacy. 4-valve heads do not have very good combustion chambers. Almost inevitably, a wedge-type chamber is a much more efficient burner, in spite of the plug location inside. One of the big giveaways to this is that if you analyze the brake-specific air consumption of an engine, a Mini engine is one of the best engines in the world. That combustion chamber burns the fuel better than a Cosworth Formula 1 engine. It doesn't breathe as well, but for every cubic foot of air that engine inhales and burns, it produces more power than the current Formula 1 Cosworth engine, which is about one of the most efficient of the Formula 1 engines. And that's something to think about there. Now let's get back to this. We've got 2 sets of intake valves here. Both of them the same combined area. This here equals this. Now, if I lift the 2 intake valves 1/10 of an inch, I get a curtain area around each valve equal to 6.628 of a square inch. If I lift this same area of valve in single valve form, 1/10 of an inch, I only get 0.444 square inches. This means that the 4-valve, the 2 intake valves, produce 30% more through flow area for the same valve lift and the same valve area. This is why a 4-valve engine breathes inherently better. It's because it presents breathing area to the cylinder faster and sooner in the cycle. Most of you have probably not thought about this, but in a Mini engine, the peak demand on the intake valve occurs at about 74 degrees after TDC. But the valve doesn't reach full open until about 102 to 110, depending on your cam. So always the valve's lagging behind what the demand of the cylinder is. So if we can improve the low lift flow in that first part of the induction stroke, we are going to make realistic gains in the power. It's not going to be easy to plug in 2 intake valves into a cast iron Mini head. So we've got to find another way of doing it. Oh, I'm dragging this out, aren't I? Turn to the next page here. What you see is, in graphic form, is 2 valves versus 1 valve. This is the available area. You can see the 2 valve is dramatically superior. Now that's just area. Now if we check this on a flow bench in a real cylinder head, we get very similar results. You turn to the next page, you'll see a 2-valve head, 2 intake valves versus 1 intake valve, both of the same area. You'll see that the single valve almost matches the top end flow of the 2 intake valves. Now this small difference here is simply due to the better port on the 4-valve engine. But that small difference did not account for the almost 20% difference in power output. What we need for the mini engine is a technique where it will allow the cylinder to breathe quicker sooner. And there's a way we can do that. Turn to the next page. What we have here is an analyzation of 30-degree valve seat versus a 45. If you lift the valve on a 45-degree seat, if you lift the valve 50 thousandths, the seat does not get 50 thousandths further away. Here it's worked out. It only gets 35 thousandths further away. So the gap between the seats on a 45-degree seat at 50 thousandths lift is only 35 thousandths. On the other hand, if you make a 30-degree intake seat, it's 43 thousandths. That's 23% better. So in other words, if we change to a 30-degree seat, at least in terms of area, we've cut the difference of 30% between 2 intake valves and 1 down to only a 7% deficiency. So that's what we're going to look at. Now in graphic form, you can see here the difference between a 30 and a 45. Now this difference in available area does not go on indefinitely. It only occurs at the low end of the lift range. By the time that valve's got to about 150 to 200 thousandths, depending on the size of the valve, that area gain or area superiority of the 30-degree seat has gone. The geometry between seats gets really complicated. And this is one of the reasons why when you, if you ever get into cylinder head seriously, SAE deals with the curtain area. They never calculate the seat deal. It's not till the advent of computers that it became practical to actually deal with the gap that existed between the valve and the seat, because it goes through 3 distinct geometric changes. Now we all know that to make a valve seat work successfully, we have to blend it into the port. And what we see here is a typical 45-degree seat blended into the port. If we do that same blend deal with a 30-degree seat, we end up with a smaller hole underneath the seat. Now what happens in this instance is the 30-degree seat is better at low lift, but at high lift it's worse because of this reduced breathing area. And therein lies a problem. To appreciate why this problem occurs, we need to understand the relative importance between low lift flow and high lift flow. What we find is that high lift flow is good for making peak horsepower. Low lift flow is good for extending the RPM range. If we could say produce a head which only had good high lift flow and it was terrible everywhere else, we would find that we tend to produce a very peaky engine. Yeah, it hit peak horsepower, but before it and after it, it wouldn't be very good. On the other hand, any of those of you who drive 4-valve engines, especially 4-valve racing engines, one of the things they do is have a very wide power band. That's because they can breathe everywhere in the rev range. Everywhere in the lift curve. Now, as the engine RPM gets higher, we find that the need to fill the cylinder happens later and later in the cycle. Typically on a mini engine at peak power, 20% of the cylinder filling occurs after the piston has reached bottom dead center, which means that what happens to that 20% is governed by the low lift flow. Now, as RPM goes up, so more and more of the total cylinder filling happens after bottom dead center. So it's necessary, if we're going to get an engine with a very wide power band that hangs on after peak power, to improve the low lift flow. Now, the low lift flow also affects peak power, but not as much as the high lift flow. So bear that in mind. Now the thing is if we could increase the low lift flow without any loss of high lift flow, we'd be dollars in the bank. And there's a way that that can be done. It's really simple. Turn to this drawing here. This is the significant factor which makes it possible. Study this drawing. It doesn't take much studying. You see the top one here, we've got the two surfaces joined by a radius and air flowing over them. The other one down, the second one, is a sharp bend. Now if we only make a transition of 15 degrees or less, the air has no idea that it's gone over a sharp edge. It thinks it's gone over a curve. Now when we start to get to things larger than valve seats, this angle drops. I mean, people who are into making megaphones are probably well aware of the fact that you can't have a megaphone diverge them more than about 10 or 12 degrees, or there's a dead area. It doesn't expand with the taper. The exhaust doesn't expand with the taper. Now, we can use this to good effect. What we're going to do, instead of using a radius to join our 30-degree seat into the port, we're going to cheat a little. Instead of putting that radius so that it joins the seat tangentially, we're going to make it join so it actually makes a 15-degree edge just at the seat, which means that we now can get the area underneath the port to be virtually the same, well, at least within thousandths of an inch of what a 45-degree seat is. So now we've got the ability to blend a 30-degree seat in such a manner as that at high lift it will flow as if it's 45, but at low lift it will flow as if it's 30. Underneath Fig 5 you will see another drawing. This is Fig 6, strange as it may seem. Now what this is a scale drawing of what you will need to do to virtually replicate a true radius. I mean, most of you won't have the kind of equipment necessary to grind special cutters to make these radius seats like this. But you may well get hold of Quickway seat grinders, in which case this is to scale. So figure that the valve seat itself is 50 thousandths, and then work out what it's going to be for your particular application by just measuring off this drawing. It is not super critical so long as you get it to look like that at the end. That will give away very little to a full radius seat done on a $40,000 machine. Let's turn to the next page here, and this gets us back to the kind of flow improvements that we typically see using that 30-degree valve. You can see that the greatest gains occur, now this is typical, these figures are averaged over several different cylinder heads of different brands, namely Mini, Chevrolet, Crossflow Ford, Big Block Chevrolet, 289 Ford, and Pinto. So it's a fairly good cross-section. I've not tried them on a 4-valve head yet. Now, undoubtedly they'd work on a 4-valve head, so then you know, if your competition does it on 4-valve heads, you now lose the advantage with them, so it closes the door again. So don't tell guys with 4-valve heads about this, and they'll wonder how your 2-valve motor goes so well. Anyway, the thing is we've got this set up on one of our Chevy engines. It's a modified 350. It's in a Chevy 2. And we've only got a 290-degree cam in it, so it isn't that big a cam. 290 seat timing, not at 50. And it's in a Chevy 2, which is gutted inside, so I figure it weighs about 2,400 pounds. It's a little over a ton. And that car will do a quarter mile in 9.01 seconds, and at miles an hour, about 150. The engine is almost street drivable. And on the dyno, it made 638 horsepower. So we're finding that this is much better power figures than we'd expect if we were using 45-degree seats. So anyway, that's would you like to have a 635 horsepower Mini? It'd be totally undrivable. Anyway, one more little aside here. It's very tempting to make ports too big. The obvious premise is that if some's good, more's better, and too much must be just right. So, unfortunately, that is very often the hot rodders' philosophy, even whether they realize it or not. One of the things with ports, and this applies especially to Minis, is that you need a high-speed exhaust port. And the reason is that the energy in the exhaust is what does the extracting in the cylinder. And it's all very well, you can easily believe that induction lengths are the key factor. On a Mini, they're more of a key factor than many other engines because they don't respond to shockwave tuning. It's nearly all inertial tuning. Now, we've tried manifolds up to 7 inches long. At the moment, the only reason we don't make manifolds any longer than that is because we don't know where to put the carburetor. But I've had friends who've tried manifolds up to 17 inches long on the dyno. And a 17-inch manifold makes more horsepower than a 7-inch one. And they didn't find the peak either. But now the carburetor is just so far away from the engine. So that's one thing that you need to be aware of. With the Mini engine, it's inertial ramming that's doing the job. But on the exhaust side, it's not. If you don't get the exhaust to work well, you're going to suffer, well, you won't. The engine will suffer a power loss. Now, what we're doing here is a look at port flow and port velocity. And one of the important things is not to keep on modifying the port just to get better flow, because the bigger the port is, very often the more it flows. But it will have lost energy. And if that exhaust port does not maintain a high speed, so there's good extraction from the cylinder, then the engine will lose a lot of volumetric efficiency. Many of you have probably don't modify your own cylinder heads because you feel that achieving that nice, smooth, polished finish all the way through is going to be so time-consuming, and maybe you don't have the tools to do it, and you think, well, if I can't do that, there isn't a lot of point in doing the cylinder head. And that's not actually so. These tests were done on a Chevrolet engine, but they're typical. The Mini engine follows very much this form here. When I use this graph, because I got it drawn out, what this is a set of Chevrolet cylinder heads where I've only worked the actual pocket, the throat area beneath the intake and exhaust. There's no polishing done on it. I just got in there with a grinder, blended everything out and reshaped it. Nothing special at all. That was the result. You can see that that was good for some 20 horsepower increase. In actual fact, on a Mini engine, going that route's actually worth, percentage-wise, a great deal more than that. Because these particular cylinder heads that I used here were the early Corvette cylinder heads, which are pretty good to start with. Now, when you do this on a Mini, a typical 1275 Mini, just pocket porting, blending it out, making a good job of the throat area, doing a back cut on the valve, and going this 30-degree seat, is going to be worth, on an engine that originally, say, produced 53 horsepower, it's going to bump it up to about 63. So we're talking about a very substantial percentage increase. I mean, that's 18%, which you should feel. I mean, hell, that's like adding another cylinder almost. Since we have a limited amount of area or bore diameter to install valves, then it's for sure we're going to use all that area. And the question arises as to how we allocate that area between the intake and exhaust valve. Now, I'm sure that many of you have heard that the exhaust needs to flow 75% of the intake. And if you heard that, that's good. That's a good ballpark figure. However, it's not fixed. There's nothing magic about that number. One of the things that affects what ratio can be used between intake and exhaust, this is more applicable to race. How many of you race minis here? How many of you want to win? About the same number. Okay, well, this is where it starts to get seriously technical. The higher the compression ratio of the engine, the less critical your exhaust flow is. Right, now you may wonder what the hell the compression ratio has got to do with the balance of flow. Well, it's quite simple. If the compression ratio goes to very high levels, now let me backtrack a bit here. The difference between a high compression and a low compression engine is that with a high compression engine they transfer more of the power from the gases to the crankshaft at the beginning of the stroke than a low compression engine. There's no thermodynamic skullduggery going on here. It's simply a question of geometry of the system. Let's imagine that we've got an engine. Let's take some extremes. Well, imagine we've got an engine with a 2-to-1 compression. We have 1,000 psi in the cylinder. I'm just picking that number because it's easy to work with. And if we open the exhaust valve, when that piston gets to bottom dead center, there's still going to be 500 psi in that cylinder. Because our expansion ratio, which is the other side of the coin to the compression ratio, is 2-to-1. So that 1,000 psi went to 500. So when that exhaust valve opens, it's going to dump a considerable amount of energy. Now, if we open that exhaust valve sooner than bottom dead center, we dump even more energy out of it. Now let's take the other extreme there. We got a 15-to-1 compression. Now let's make it easier. 10-to-1. We had 1,000 psi in the cylinder with a 10-to-1 compression. When that piston gets to the bottom of the stroke, it's only 100 psi. So if we open the valve at the bottom of the stroke now, we don't lose so much energy. There's less energy there, right? Now the thing is, with a high compression engine, more and more of the work done, useful work done on the crankshaft occurs in the first half of the stroke. Now if you've got an engine of 14-to-1 compression, it really doesn't matter if you open the valve 90 degrees before bottom dead center, because something like 90% of the useful energy has already been extracted from that gas. And if you plot this back, you'll find that that's pretty hard to get much over that, because all the rod angles get to be wrong as it gets around bottom dead center. So, since you can open the exhaust valve so early, you can put a smaller exhaust valve in. And you can use a larger intake, which will now allow you to rev the engine higher. So you can see that the exhaust to intake ratio really is dependent on the compression ratio. Question is you're going to raise this now, is that how much compression can we use? That's really dependent on the camshaft. A friend of mine who has been doing a lot of successful cams for Winston Cup pointed out to me about, a couple of years ago, that in his experience, all race engines, all successful race engines, run at 9-to-1 compression. Now, first thing it says, that's BS. We just talked about 14-to-1. But he's talking about this in relation to intake valve closure. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have had the problem of knowing how much compression you should use on your engine, and maybe not even realizing that the compression that you use must be related to the camshaft. If you don't have a good compression ratio to cam compatibility, the engine is going to lose horsepower. You're not making the most of the camshaft. But okay, let's assume that you have a reasonable octane number. We'll talk about how to get them in a minute. But so for your race engine, you need to calculate the compression ratio as 9-to-1 from the point of valve closure, which means that when you get to your formula, you don't put in the capacity of the cylinder. When the piston's at bottom dead center, you put in the capacity of the cylinder remaining above the piston when the intake valve closes. Do not use the specs given for your cam to do this. Physically measure it. Because cams are quoted at such oddball numbers that you can't relate one to another. I mean, I know of so many different systems that are quoted. I mean, none of the big cam companies use the same system. Somebody asked me about seats and inserts. Okay? Problem with inserts coming out is one of the things that I guess that many cylinder heads have now been around so long, they're going to have sunken valves. And also there's going to be those of you who want to put armored seats in for unleaded use. One of the problems with seats coming out is people find it very difficult to comprehend that they need to go in with 5 to 7 thousandths interference. Because that seems like a horrendous amount of interference, but that's the figure that they need to go in at. With the APT seats that we do in the States, we recommend 6 to 7 thousandths interference. Then they're there for good. So, that's, if any of you do have seats come out, it's almost always because they're too light to fit. Let me tell you a quick story. Some years ago, Jan Speed had to prepare cylinder heads for 500 minis being exported to Japan. And I got to talking to Jan, and he said he was going to do this, said he needed to use armored seats. So I said, hey, try ours. I said, they virtually don't wear out. And the reason we developed them was so we could use them in Chevrolet engines, because we could make the seat live at only the same diameter as a valve. For instance, we wanted to put a 1.6 inch exhaust valve, but there isn't any more room for an insert bigger than 1.6, 25 thousandths bigger, because you run into the intake. So we had to come up with a material which was tough and very hard, so that it would not need to be a very big wall thickness. So we sent them over a batch of seats, and they had 4 or 5 minis in which they used 2 different types of inserts in each cylinder head, and they ran them for 20,000 miles and then took them all down. Ours was the only seats that showed no wear, and also ours was the cheapest. And that's after they'd been shipped to England. They were cheaper on their desk than the prices quoted by other companies before delivery. And that's what went on all these engines to Japan. We've had no problems with the whole 500 minis. So if you do need armored seats, APT has some really inexpensive seats that will be there long after you're not. One of the things that we often confuse is the requirement for octane for horsepower, right? The object of the exercise, you should never lose sight of the object of the exercise. And in this instance, what we're trying to achieve is horsepower at the driving wheels. We're not out to necessarily have high octane fuel. It's only valid, having high octane fuel is only valid if it does actually result in more power at the wheels. Now, the thing is that it is possible to have a fuel of high octane which actually makes less power at the wheels than a lower octane one. And the other thing is that the octane value you see can be dramatically changed in effectiveness by the way you run your engine. For instance, about every 8.5 degrees increase in intake temperature takes 1 octane number more before it to avoid detonation. So if you're running your engine with 24 degrees more intake temperature than your fellow competitor here, you better have 3 octane numbers more. just to be able to use the same compression ratio. So the first thing to do is to insulate the intake charge from engine heat. There's lots of ways that can be done. I mean, if you're forced to use fuel of only 96 octane, then you're going to have to do some serious thermal barrier coatings on the intake ports, especially prevalent point of picking up temperature is the intake valve. We always tend to think of the intake valve as running cool, but why does it run cool? Because it dumps the heat into the intake charge. And we don't want it there. Now the intake valve actually experiences a greater number of BTUs pass through it than the exhaust valve does, because it's a bigger area. The thing is if you coat the intake valve, you can drop 40 or 50 degrees out of the intake charge temperature. That'll make 96 octane fuel think it's 100 octane. So you can pick up 4 points at least right there. Okay, well, for the most part, avgas does not make a very good racing fuel. The problem with it is it's designed for operation at 10,000 feet or more, so it has very low front-end hydrocarbons on it. Now, fortunately, a mini engine is one of the least sensitive to this. But before you go sticking avgas into your engine, you need to get on a chassis dyno and check that it's actually doing what you require it to do, and that's make more horsepower at the wheels. The other thing is they put additives in it that stop it growing funguses and things like this. Because, you know, if your airplane engine conks out and you're 300 miles out over the ocean, you definitely got a problem. Unless you've got another engine or two to keep you going. The third thing is that it's slow burning, which greatly affects the amount of ignition advance you need. And the problem is that a lot of it, basically an engine needs to reach its peak pressure, a mini engine needs to reach its peak cylinder pressure around about 14 degrees after TDC. Now, when your ignition timing does that, the engine will make the most horsepower. What happens is, with this high-octane aviation fuel, is it burns so slowly that if you use typical ignition advance figures, you're going to have to, it's going to reach peak pressures at 16, 18, even 20 degrees, and it's going to lose power. Dynamite burns at just over 2,000 miles an hour. So what goes on in the cylinder is a burn. The only exception to that is when the engine detonates. Then that is definitely an explosion, in which most of the heat energy released goes into the cylinder walls and pistons due to the vibration it causes. Now, when we're choosing the octane of the fuel, we're only trying to get it the subject to horsepower by inference, right? It's not the octane we want, it's the horsepower. So the most effective fuels in a Mini are going to be those which burn the quickest, because you do not want pressure built up, needlessly built up, when the piston's coming up the bore. Remember, on a long stroke engine, 40 degrees before TDC represents a lot more piston movement before the top of the stroke than it does on a short stroke engine. So if you've got to run 40 degrees ignition timing on a mini engine, there's a far greater percentage of buildup of pressure before TDC than there is in a short stroke engine. The best engines are those that produce their power with only 28 to 30 degrees. That means there's good agitation in the cylinder, the compression's adequate, and things like this. And talking about compression as well with a cam, one of the easy ways to figure whether you've got it right or not is to crank the motor over and use a pressure gauge. If you don't see 220 psi cranking pressure, you probably haven't got enough compression or some leak somewhere. But if the engine doesn't leak, 220 psi is a good figure to shoot for. So when you all get home, check it. Now if you've got a street motor and you've got to run on more sane levels of octane, then figure about 190 to 200 is going to be it. For what it's worth, I don't know if you guys can get it, the Olden octane booster works well. Olden. And I have to take credit for designing it because I couldn't find an octane booster that works, so I made my own. And then Olden Automotive in England bought the license of it. Ford Motor Company used that octane booster in the Mexico rally some years ago, and they boosted the Mexico 76 octane fuel to 96 with it. So it's 20 numbers there. We've boosted fuel. And of course, if you can't add it to the fuel, that's cheating, right? And I can't say anything about that, but you can make ordinary pump fuel 108 octane R plus M over 2, not research. And the nice thing about it is it's not temperature sensitive. Anybody that's got turbo motors, trying to heat the octane out of it is very difficult. It will maintain its octane rating on the motoring octane as well. So I don't know if anyone wants to get that bulk purchase. I don't know how you ship that stuff overseas, but Alden Automotive in England has an octane booster that's relatively inexpensive that will do the job. And since it's non-metallic and all petroleum based, it's the devil to find it in a fuel check. There's one easy way to find it, is spill some on your paint. Right? Hey, it's also very good as a paint stripper. It's also very poison. Here's something of interest, actually, just by the way. If somebody sells you an octane booster they say is not very poisonous, one thing you can be sure of is also not very good as an octane booster. It just seems that virtually every substance which is good as an octane booster is also deadly poison. If you get any of this Alden octane booster, do not get it on your hands. Definitely do not get it in your mouth. Right? It goes in your gas tank and nowhere else. That's why we chrome our intake manifolds at APT, because it reflects the exhaust heat. And we've actually raced at Riverside in the middle of summer on a humid day, pulled into the pits, opened the bonnet, I almost said hood then, opened the bonnet, and there is hoarfrost on the intake manifold. Now we've had guys have bought our other manifolds identical in form but not chrome plated. Right? But when we checked theirs, you couldn't put your hand on the intake manifold because it burned. So the temperature difference between a chrome plated one and a non-chrome plated one can be over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So the chrome isn't on there for show, I assure you. Try, and this is especially important for a Mini, because you guys race in hot weather here. We dream about this in England, you know, and it happens like once every 10 years. We get a summer's day that coincides with race day. But you guys must race in hot weather almost all the time. This means that for a Mini, a lot of the fuel has evaporated, the front-end hydrocarbons have evaporated, and this causes a problem. A drop of the fuel, when it evaporates, takes up 100 times the space, which means it cuts down the volumetric efficiency of the engine. Not something you'd normally think about. So in hot weather, what I used to do, when it was hot weather, which was damned infrequently, was I would blow air through a 5-gallon can of fuel to evaporate off a certain percentage of it. So what I was left with was the less volatile ones, so it didn't evaporate in the intake manifold, so the volumetric efficiency was higher. Under those conditions, it's worth about 3 horsepower if you want to go to that trouble. So nearly all these fuels you get, but you see, here's the other thing, probably the fuels you buy here are already formulated so that they have the appropriate distillation curve for the temperatures. But like I said, most fuels these days won't be formulated for Mini engines because they're few and far between. So you still may want to try mixing your own fuels, and you try mixing avgas with regular service station pump fuel. Oh, I know what you can do. I got the fix, right? If you want to hop up your avgas, put 10% toluene in it because it's a very good ignition accelerator. If that doesn't work, try 20%. You know, a lot of the high-octane fuels these days have a very high percentage of toluene in them. And I wouldn't be surprised if your premium-grade fuels, well, I know that Shell and BP and several others have already got over 20% toluene in them. So you're just adding to that. The toluene itself has got a 110 octane fuel rating, but you can't figure out the result by saying, okay, we've got 110 octane here, and we're going to mix 1 gallon of this with 9 gallons of 100 octane. You won't end up with the numbers because of an effect known as the blending octane. What will happen is if you add a small percentage of some high octane material, it can appear, the end result appears that it had a higher octane than it really did. For instance, when you start blending toluene in to a gasoline that doesn't have it, and you put, say, 3% of it in, it has the same effect as if it's 140 octane. But as the mix gets higher and higher and higher, so the blending octane comes down. So I really can't say what it's going to do, but if it's already got 20% in, adding another 10% at my best guess is it will react as if it's about 115 octane. It's something which I'd taken for granted, but I now realize it could be a lot of problems with people. You want to raise the compression on your motor so it's just shy of detonating. Well, your immediate reaction is, well, if I go on skimming the cylinder head until it detonates, I've now gone too far. So what do? Carve all the chambers out. Well, that's just a pain in the backside to do. Well, there's an easy way around it, because Steve asked me this question. How do I get that close without ruining the cylinder head? It's real simple. Let's say you normally run your engine on, we'll say, 100 octane fuel, right? And you want to make it so it doesn't detonate on 100 octane fuel, but it does on 99. You're going to give yourself 1 octane number. It's quite simple. What you do is you take a lower grade of fuel and you dilute your 100 octane fuel to 99. Now, if you're mixing fuels to only change it by one number, you can figure your blending figures come out pretty close to the same as the ratio. So what you do is you take your 9 gallons of your 100 octane fuel and put 1 gallon of regular in it. Now you go on skimming the head until it just detonates on that. In your next tank full of fuel, you just put a straight 100 octane fuel in it, right? And you know you're one number off it. No need to even take the cylinder head off to take the compression ratio down. So that's the easy way to do it. The Mini has a strange affair with camshafts. It's not like any other engine. Or at least it's not like any other engine that has, unless it has Siamese ports. And there are a few of those. I mean, there's a big 6-cylinder Chevrolet engine that looks like 1.5 Mini engines which have overgrown and got stuck together. So it looks like 50% more trouble than a Mini engine. Anyway, one of the problems with the Mini engine that was rarely addressed is that it was assumed to be one 4-cylinder engine. This is not the case. It is 4 1-cylinder engines with different characteristics. So, now you've probably all heard of the scatter pattern cams that I worked so diligently on a few years ago. So what I'm going to do is tell you how come they came into being. We got to a point where at about 300 degrees, if we extended the valve timing longer than that, there was no gain in power. What happened was I started out looking at the power gain with each increment of 10 degrees, or thereabouts, and plotting it out. And as the cams get to about 300 degrees, so the increase in power not only levels out, but actually starts to drop off. And this came about when I tested the Leyland Sprint and Super Sprint cams and found them to be very disappointing. They really didn't do anything for my 1275, no matter how I used them. And I really went to a lot of trouble to try and optimize them in terms of changing exhaust manifolds and intakes and things like this. And the results were very disappointing. It was only by building an extremely high compression engine with some really oddball characteristics that I could make a Sprint cam produce more horsepower, but over a very narrow power band. Anyway, it dawned on me. Well, actually, it didn't dawn on me. A friend of mine, Harry Ratcliffe, at a company called BVRT in England, said that he had been playing around with cams where he used different timing. Because he said, you know, what happens is the intake on number 1 cylinder robs number 2. The easy way to remember what happens here is that with a Mini engine, we have a situation whereby the firing on the induction strokes on each intake port aren't 180 degrees apart. They're not 360 degrees apart, sorry. They're 180 and 540. So you get 2 induction pulses together, then a big vacant space, and 2 induction pulses. On the other port, space between them. So what happens is the first cylinder to draw out of that pair always gets the worst of the deal. This is a way to remember, first is worst. What happens is the scavenging effect and the early opening of the outer cylinders stops the inner cylinders filling after bottom dead center. The air tends to go into those outer cylinders, especially as the outer cylinders can have a very efficient exhaust. The exhaust on the outer cylinders is just like any 8-port head. There's no deficiency in exhaust performance. So what it does is it draws the charge in, and at the same time stops the charge going into the inner cylinders. So the volumetric efficiency on the inner cylinders is bad and very good on the outside. So it's like robbing Peter to pay Paul, which doesn't actually result in any good power figures. So what we did with the scatter pattern cams was treat the cylinders as independent engines and develop the profile to suit the cylinder they were on. And we found that more exhaust timing was needed, but on the center cylinders. The lobe centerline angle on the center cylinders needed to be drastically different to those on the outside cylinders. It was very difficult isolating the effects because whether we like it or not, it was not practical to saw the engine up to 4 engines. So we had to try and find out what was going on with all those 3 cylinders still there. I won't go into details on that, but it did take a long time of analyzing printouts from the computer attached to the dyno. But finally we got there. And I'm sure you can all appreciate that by having a cam which has all the right timing figures, or rather more correctly timed valve events for each cylinder, is going to make more horsepower. However, one of the things, there's a disadvantage to this. Right? It's not an apparent disadvantage. It wasn't something that we thought about until we'd had cams out in the field. And that is, if you've got a regular cam and you mistime it, it doesn't actually make that much difference to the power. Because if you advance the cam too much, what happens is one pair of cylinders starts to work better and the other pair works worse. And then if you retard it too much, they swap over because of the different requirements. So with a single pattern cam, if you mistime the cam, you can be anywhere in an 8-degree or even 10-degree range, and they'll produce almost the same power. You don't really notice a difference. But when you get the valve timing right for every damn cylinder, boy, you're 2 degrees off and you've just dumped a load of power, because now all 4 cylinders are wrong. Instead of correcting the timing on one at the expense of the other, you're making all of them wrong. So one of the things I tell people, if they're going to use a scatter pattern cam, get a vernier sprocket and try the cam at various settings so it suits your engine. And doing it that way, you'll get the benefits of it. And those scatter pattern cams are typically worth 8 to 10 foot-pounds more than a single time cam. So if you feel you're going to make the transition to a scatter pattern cam, then that's the way to do it, is figure you're going to buy not only the cam, but also a vernier sprocket to go with it. Anyway, the thing is with the mini profiles is that, earlier on I was talking about how it's necessary to present the cylinder with as much breathing as early on as possible. Well, we can either do that by the valve seats. Well, that's one avenue open to us. The other avenue open to us is to open the valve as quickly as possible. And because the Mini is an undervalved engine, it's very sensitive to valve accelerations and valve velocity. Now, there's certain limitations that we get with a Mini valve train. When you think about super trick pushrod valve trains, you immediately think in terms of rollers. Well, there aren't any rollers available for a Mini, right? It's not something that is impossible to do, but it's just something that would be very expensive and not in keeping with what's normally done with a Mini engine. It make it something that's very special, to the point where the cost of running a race Mini would probably invalidate the whole purpose of running a car that's relatively inexpensive to run. However, going to a roller cam isn't necessarily a cure. What's not commonly realized is that you cannot accelerate a roller cam as fast as you can accelerate a flat tappet cam. If you turn to this drawing in your books, what I'm showing here is how the contact patch is out towards the edge of the lifter. Right? See that B dimension there? That radius determines the velocity that can be put into the tappet. The larger the tappet diameter, the more velocity can be put into it. You can see it's like the stroke of a crankshaft. If I've got this much radius and I'm turning the cam at a certain speed, well, the lifting speed at that point is quite high, whereas halfway down it's not very much. So, extra velocity can be put into the valve train by boring out the lifter bores and putting in a larger lifter. I see a head nodding back there. So somebody's obviously tried it. There's various ones you can use, actually. Volkswagen ones are a probability. So as a crossflow Ford, you have to sleeve the holes down. And when you look at this drawing here, you can appreciate the fact that when the cam is around on the heel, the contact patch is in the middle of the lifter. Now, the acceleration that's put onto the lifter is the rate at which the contact patch moves to the edge. Does that make sense? Everybody nod. Yeah? Let's see some nodding here. Right. I'm not going to tell you how ridiculous it is. But anyway, it moves out. The rate at which it moves out determines the acceleration. Now, with a flat tappet cam, you could, if the components were strong enough to do that, design the profile so that point there moved virtually instantaneously to the edge. In other words, you've now put infinite acceleration into that valve train. So the velocity of the valve goes from nothing to 25 miles an hour instantly. Unfortunately, we can't do that. We're just going to trash out our valve train. So basically, with a flat tappet cam, they are velocity limited, but acceleration unlimited. With a roller cam, a roller follower, the reverse applies. There's a limitation on the acceleration. Because you have a roller, what happens is as it comes around on the roller, so it tries to push the roller sideways. To accelerate it infinitely, you'd have to have a vertical flank. You can see when it hits the roller, it's not pushing the roller upwards, it's pushing it sideways. So that's what's called the pressure angle. And for a roller cam, you can only go to about a 30-degree pressure angle. And those angles don't supply the acceleration rates that can be achieved with a flat tappet cam. But, having said that, the velocity on the roller is not limited. You can crank the speed up on that for however as much you want to put into the valve train for whatever it will stand. Bearing in mind, the faster you move the lifter, the more spring you've got to put in it to stop it. So anyway, the thing is with a mini engine, it's not really essential to go to the complexity of a roller follower, but it is worthwhile going to a larger diameter follower. But having done that, you now have to have a cam profile that takes advantage of it. With the cams that I've done for APT, the velocities and the accelerations are consistent with what the materials and that particular diameter of follower will stand. Now the interesting thing is if we step up to an 843 follower, which is small block Chevrolet size, and it's only a little bit bigger, we suddenly have over 2,000 proven profiles available to us to use. However, there is one problem with grinding a Chevrolet profile onto a stock Leyland cam. And that is, to regrind the cam, you're going to have to take the base circle down, which inevitably makes the nose profile too small, so the kind of surface loadings that the Chevrolet profile brings about overloads the cam and it breaks down. So it can only be done, the Chevrolet profiles can only be successfully done on a billet cam. So it makes them expensive, but they're a lot less expensive than going the roller route. And for what it's worth, they're more effective as well. So anybody looking to get that edge with valve train for a mini engine or any A-series engine, then there's power to be had with larger lifters and more aggressive profiles. I would say that for a 1293 engine, going to 843 lifter and a good Chevrolet profile, there's a good 5 horsepower there in terms of extra power at the top end, and probably 4 or 5 foot-pounds throughout the used RPM range. And if you're prepared to go to a bigger lifter diameter yet, like a Ford or an AMC size lifter, which has got a 900 thousandths diameter base, which incidentally may be difficult to accommodate in the block, but then it would be necessary to hard face the cams to be able to stand the loads. But that could be a 10 horsepower deal, because it could open the valves. If you go to a 904 lifter, you can get somewhere in the region of 12% more velocity in the valve, and it definitely pays off. Again, because we have this long stroke engine which doesn't have enough valve area. We've got scatter pattern cams now at 310 degrees, and normally going from 300 degrees to 310 you lose power. We've picked up power on that, but that extra 10 degrees is about all the margin that we can get by going to the scatter pattern profile. I mean, we may be able to go to 312, but you know, right now 310 is it. So our 310 scatter pattern cam shows a power advantage over the 300 one or 291. But I don't believe that there's much left in it unless we go to more aggressive valve action. My personal feeling at this stage is I'd rather increase the lifter diameter and keep the cam slightly shorter, because it makes more foot-pounds. And the bottom line is when we have a saying around our shop, horsepower numbers sells engines, foot-pounds wins races. People look too much at that top-end figure.
Yeah, I've got one of your scatter cams in my car, right? I think it's the 310, is it?
310 one.
310, right. Under 3,000, you put your foot down, it just doesn't pull. Is that correct?
That doesn't surprise me one bit. That's doing exactly what it should do.
I've got an older...
Now, what compression are you using?
Pardon?
What compression ratio are you using?
9.75.
You're way off the pace. How many cubic inches is the engine? What cc?
It's 1330.
1330. I'm amazed that it runs at 3,000. I really am amazed that it runs at 3,000. We use those at 14 to 1.
So what do I do?
When you get home, take the cylinder head off, get yourself a big file and start filing.
But then I can't run it on the road.
Well, then you picked the wrong cam.
Who sold me the cam? Where is it?
Then you picked the wrong cam. You either come to terms. You see, now the thing is your engine at 9 point, your detonation is not dependent on your static compression.
It's not detonating. It's overrunning.
It's running on. Then check your spark plug to see if you get the right heat range. Check that you don't have a hot spot in the cylinder, in the cylinder head. You know, what cylinder head is it? Is it an early one that's had a lot of rust in it? Because some cylinder heads will do this, and you know, we found very often that acid dipping the cylinder heads either fixes it, and if it doesn't fix it, we trash the head. There are occasions when you get what have you got in there for a thermostat?
No, blanking sleeve.
You got a blanking sleeve.
And the head's popped off.
Right. Okay. One of the things is it's not often appreciated, but the boiling point of the water in the block is largely controlled by the pressure that the water pump puts out. The reason that banking sleeve is in there is to allow the block pressure to build up. And on a mini engine at 7,000 RPM, there's about 60 psi of water pressure in the block. And that puts the boiling point of the water to somewhere about 320. Right? It also cuts down the possibility of localized hot spots, producing a lot of steam and becoming even hotter. But if you've got detonation or if you've got running on at 9.75, there's a fundamental cooling problem somewhere. And you know,
It doesn't run hot. Runs good. Runs about 70 degrees.
Yeah, but that's the bulk temperature, right? You're not interested in the bulk temperature. An engine either runs on or becomes detonation limited by the temperature of the highest spot in the engine. It's the same. It doesn't matter if you've got a chain where every link takes 200 tons to break it except one that takes 50. That chain is only going to hold 50 tons, right? Same as with your engine. If you've got a spot that overheats, it doesn't matter if the block's frozen solid. If there's one place that's 500 degrees, it's going to detonate. And the temperature around the cylinder head really does get high. If you could probe that there between the cylinders, the block gets to 500 degrees Fahrenheit, no sweat.
So what compression ratio should I run with that cam in my board?
If you were running that cam, if you go back and do that,
Sort of like road use, but
Yeah.
sprints, you know, sort of.
go back and work it out on the 8.5 to 1 that I talked about, based on valve closure, right? If that engine detonates, then you need to consider that whether or not the ignition timing's right for it, or whether you have a cylinder head with a hot spot in it. Now, it'd be a good idea just to try it with another head, even if it was just a stock one. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Good. But apart from that, it's a great cam. Jan Speed did some testing with one of those, and Jan's a dyed-in-the-wool user of Sprint, Super Sprint cams, and when they put this cam in, he said he couldn't believe it made almost 20 horsepower difference. That was on a 1293. And he didn't have enough compression in it. I said to him, you know, they were running at 12.5, and I said, you're 1.5 ratios under.
So it's got to have high compression for that cam to work.
If you want to get, let me tell you, that cam, you can make 106 horsepower per liter out of a mini engine. If you want to get that kind of figure, then you better be thinking in terms of 14 to 1. But the dynamic compression, that's the static compression. The dynamic compression, that valve doesn't close till the piston's almost halfway up the bore. So it's not as bad as it looks or it sounds. One of the things when cams are being designed is that it's yeah, right, good. But apart from that, it's a great cam. Jan Speed did some testing with one of those, and Jan's a dyed-in-the-wool user of Sprint, Super Sprint cams, and when they put this cam in, he said he couldn't believe it made almost 20 horsepower difference. That was on a 1293. And he didn't have enough compression in it. I said to him, you know, they were running at 12.5, and I said, you're 1.5 ratios under.
So it's got to have high compression for that cam to work.
If you want to get, let me tell you, that cam, you can make 106 horsepower per liter out of a mini engine. If you want to get that kind of figure, then you better be thinking in terms of 14 to 1. But the dynamic compression, that's the static compression. The dynamic compression, that valve doesn't close till the piston's almost halfway up the bore. So it's not as bad as it looks or it sounds. One of the things when cams are being designed is that it's very important to try and design a profile which minimizes valve train vibration. Because as soon as the vibration starts, then what happens at the valve isn't what the designer intended to happen. Part of the vibrations that are put into a camshaft are crankshaft vibrations. Some race engine builders have gone to using gear drives that are terribly reliable and absolutely guaranteed to transmit every single vibration, torsional vibration, that the crank goes through straight into the cam and valve train, totally destroying all the efforts of the cam designer to produce smooth dynamics. Normally going to a gear drive is a good way to lose about 5% of the power of the engine. So maybe none of you have done it, but don't even bother trying. Now, a gear drive, a chain drive rather, is usually a better bet. But even so, a chain drive on the tension side still represents a relatively solid deal. And very often, a belt drive such as that Mini Spares does, and a few other companies do them now, not only is it quieter, it gets rid of all that noise from the front end of the engine, but also it does allow the engine to make more horsepower because it tends to damp the vibrations going to the camshaft. Now, also an extension of that question is the fact that probably somebody's going to ask about crank dampers. So in connection with crankshaft vibrations going into the valve train, I'll make a few points on crank dampers. The dampers that you buy, these rubber, there's a proper term for them. I can't remember what the proper name for them is, but the mass mounted, an outer flywheel mounted on rubber. The problem is they have to be a certain mass and a certain consistency of rubber, so that they're frequency sensitive, and they have to be sensitive to the frequency that the crank and flywheel piston and rod assembly vibrates at. Now, the thing is when you're building a race engine, the very things that affect the vibration frequency of the engine get changed. You put lightweight flywheel on. You lighten up the rods. You put lighter pistons on. All of these things affect the vibrational frequency of the crankshaft. So the next thing is you stick a stock damper on the front of it. Well, hey presto, this thing works at 6,000 RPM and you're never down there. You're running your engine now up in an RPM range where that damper may actually be exciting vibrations. So this is a point to be aware of, is that a crank damper can be influential on the power output of the engine. And one of the dampers that I recommend to people, and you're going to have to do a bit of work yourself on here, is to use a Vibratech viscous damper. Now, this type of damper was originally designed many years ago for use on diesel engines, which have some really horrific loadings, cyclic loadings, and more so when you consider a lot of diesels, especially marine ones, are 6 and 8 cylinders in line. Well, they got crankshafts which have tremendous torsionals in them. Typically, some of these engines will not last 2 minutes without the crank damper on. They will just break the cranks. So these viscous dampers are good in one respect. They'll damp vibrations at any RPM that they occur at. You don't have to find out what the vibrational frequency of your crank and rods and piston assembly is. You just stick on one of these dampers, knowing full well that wherever the vibrations occur, it's going to get them. And the other thing is it works far better. Even when a stock vibration damper is correctly tuned, a well-designed viscous damper will get the vibrations far more effectively. Some tests I did in my shop with some vibration gear that we rented showed that the Vibratech damper, we tested all the ones for Chevrolets that we could. The Vibratech damper was 400% better at damping vibrations at peak than any other damper, and that went through all the factory dampers as well. If you don't know what vibration frequency is, and you decide that you can't afford to have a damper, buy one of these dampers and make up the hub to mount it, then generally speaking, you're better off with the heavier dampers. They will more likely hit the frequency that a typical tuned engine is going to run to. So that's a point there. Don't overlook your damper. I know on the front of my book I got an engine without a damper. Anybody notice that? You get 10 points. I'm glad you didn't say anything. We don't have to throw you out now. So, but that was a drag race engine, and that was an engine which ultimately ended up doing some damper testing. And it got photographed like that because it looked neat stuff at the time. As you might expect, they're not cheap. I mean, this is the same kind of damper that most of the Formula One teams use on the front of their engines. And that's getting more and more critical now. They're going to V10s and have these long cranks with funny throws on. But we really don't have the demand for them. I mean, we only sell maybe 2 or 3 a year. So that, there's not the demand for us to tool up and make them. How many of you have seen problems with push rods that when you look down through the block they're clear? And yet when you pull those push rods out you can see they've been hitting on the cylinder head of the block. Anybody experienced that problem? Come on, you must have done. You have? Well, interesting point here. At Comp Cams, they got a new deal which you can film a valve train running at 8,000 RPM, and this camera they got, it takes 12,000 frames a second, right? Let me tell you, film comes out of it, well, videotape actually. It uses videotape at a great rate. But the thing is just testing push rods for stiffness is not the end of the story. What happens to the push rods is, because the rocker goes through an angle, they don't move straight up and down like this. And what happens is the end is the moving, and the mass in the middle of the push rod starts to bow backwards and forwards. And in that respect, you'll find that a tubular push rod, even though its column strength may be no better, in practice, on the engine, got a nodding head here, on the engine, you found this on the engine, they work far better. For instance, we don't use any stock push rods in our motors now. We haven't done for, I don't know, 10 years. We just use a tubular push rod. Usually when an engine runs into valve bounce, it isn't because the lifters left the nose of the cam, it's because the valve hits the seat and it contains so much energy, there's enough flexure in the valve that energy can't be absorbed and it bounces back off the seat again. And that part of that problem also is that the valve's not put down properly by the closing ramp. So, and that's important. And an interesting thing, on our latest profiles, we run 200 pounds of over-the-nose seat load, and we can run 1,000 RPM higher than the old Leyland 649 cam did with a 220 pound over-the-nose load, and we're lifting 500 as opposed to their 400. So, and most of that is how the valve is set down on the seat.
You find there's a lot of problems with overloading the valves, too heavy a spring.
A lot of people do go overboard on that, but that's why one of the reasons why we want to sell springs with the cam and lifters, yeah.
And what about the valve size? Should the spring be relative to the valve size then?
Not so much, no, because even a relatively heavy valve only represents a small change in the total mass of the system. So it is not very pertinent, the overall thing. Anybody tried titanium valves yet? Anybody like to try titanium valves? Yeah? Well, we haven't tried them in mini engines yet, but the thing at the moment is not just titanium valves, but titanium springs as well. Titanium makes a very good spring material. And the nice thing, one of the problems we're getting at the moment, and this is now beginning to find its way into mini valve trains, is that the spring is the worst enemy to achieving high RPM in the system. Ultimately, the spring loses control of its own mass. So, if it can't control its own mass, controlling the valve is not going to be within its capabilities either. Okay, it's gone. So, the thing is there's great strides to be made with not only going to titanium valves, but titanium springs. If you go just the titanium valve route, one of the things about titanium valves is they don't bounce as easy as steel ones because they have very high internal friction in the material. So when it hits the seat, the energy tends to go up in heat rather than spring back. So with exactly the same, even with the same weight of titanium valve, it doesn't bounce as easy. But there again, because the titanium valve is 40% lighter, that eases the situation. If anyone gets the opportunity, if somebody comes up to you and says, "I've got a set of titanium rockers, would you like to try them?" Don't bother. Because titanium makes a very good spring, it's terrible as a rocker material because it really puts vibrations into the valve train which are out of all proportion to what you'd expect. I had a friend of mine try some in a Chevrolet engine that he used in a USAC car. He ran a stock block USAC car, and his business was making things out of titanium. And he called me up and said, "I just made some titanium rockers and I was really disappointed." the engine ran into valve float 1,000 RPM earlier and we lost 70 horsepower. And he says, does this sound like, did we do something wrong? I said to him, no. I said, no. Is that material is what you're making the springs out of? He said, yeah. I said, there, that answers your question. So they don't make a very good material in it, but for springs they really do, because the beauty of them is you only need about 2 turns. So you can have a very open spring, so you can get massive valve lift without coil binding, and also very low spring mass. So they are working really good as springs. And you can actually take about 20 pounds of over-the-nose load out of the spring and still get more RPM. I'm going to pull up a graph here, which I want you to look at, which may give you some insight into what happens with cylinder pressures and port pressures. What this is here is a computer simulation of cylinder and port pressures. And it's pretty realistic simulation. This type of simulation could, up until recently, could only be done on a mainframe computer. And a friend of mine recently found some programming techniques and made some shortcuts in the basic, I say basic, I'm using that word very liberally there. There's nothing basic about the formulas to generate this. It's very complex. But he's made a couple of shortcuts which reduces the complexity of doing this to the kind of levels that a good PC will do. But anyway, let me just point out what these things are here. Basically, what we've got here is the cylinder pressure decaying after. Here's where the exhaust valve opens here. There's bottom dead center. So when the exhaust valve opens, the cylinder pressure drops. Now you can see how the cylinder pressure drops right below atmospheric here. What we've got, now this would apply to an 8-port Mini, not a 5-port one. We've got an intake shock wave resonating here. See how it reaches a peak just after the overlap area. Now this curve here is the exhaust pressure. You see how the exhaust drops down to half an atmosphere, 7.5 pounds below atmosphere in the overlap period. So the pressure differential at TDC in this particular instance is probably 8.5 psi. So there's 8.5 psi pushing that fresh charge into the cylinder, even though the piston's not even moving. And that's a considerable amount of pressure there. And what it will do is start the induction event happening about 6 degrees after the intake valve theoretically opens. I say theoretically, because I don't know how much it flexes at high RPM. But the indications are that at a theoretical 6 degrees after the intake valve is supposed to open, there's motion of the intake charge into the cylinder. By the time the piston reaches TDC, the intake charge is moving it at a substantial velocity. It's probably attained somewhere in the region of 15 to 20% of its peak velocity. So, you know, what I'm saying here is it's very important to make sure that you have everything operating right here. And this, to make all this happen, it's a question of correct intake lengths, correct exhaust lengths, and the correct opening and closing points of the exhaust valve. Now, what are we showing on here? Oh yes, here's another interesting thing here. This is on a cylinder head which doesn't breathe very well. What we've got here is the intake pressure absolute and the cylinder pressure absolute. The difference between these is the suction that the valve is across the valve, pressure drop across the valve. See, on a badly ported cylinder head, this can be as much as 6 psi. And here's a race one. It's getting more airflow with only about 2 psi pressure drop. See, ideally we try to get these two lines to coincide. That means that there's no pressure drop. And that may sound impossible to start with, but if you get this scavenging effect strong enough initially, you'll put enough energy into the intake air and the intake port to actually have these two lines coincide. And when you get that, that's when you start to get volumetric efficiencies substantially over 100. I'll tell you now, it's very hard in a mini engine to get over 90%. Engines that we've dynoed, other people's engines we've dynoed that have been relatively conventionally built, the highest I've seen was 88%. And I'm talking about 88% at peak torque, right? And when you get to peak power, it's usually down to 78, 80%. There was a lot of cheering in the shop when we managed to get it to go over 100, and the highest we've seen is 101.5 on a 5-port engine. Now I have heard of guys with 8-port engines getting up to 110, but they're few and far between. But anyway, that's interesting how we get these various pressures here. Now, one of the things that we see on this here is how the intake port pressure is still very high at the point of valve closure. See, we're talking about here, let me see, this is in, yes, it's just a tad over 5 psi at the point the intake valve closes. So this is another justification. If this intake valve flows very well at low lift, it'll allow this 5 psi to push more charge into the cylinder. And that was the point I was trying to make with these 30-degree seats, how we can improve this area here. And this is all free. It's just supercharging effect. And it certainly didn't happen there. You can see that by the time the intake valve closed, the cylinder pressure was just only atmospheric. Whereas this one here, when the intake valve closed, the pressure in the cylinder was almost, well, it's 4.5 psi. So that cylinder had a 4.5, that's not a mini engine, that one. Not a 5-port mini engine. That had a 4.5 psi supercharge effect on it. Although the Mini has a pretty long rod with 5.75 inches, its rod-stroke ratio is only fair to middling. The thing is, with any engine, the more it's starved of air, the more likely it is to need a long connecting rod in the engine. And the connection is this. The longer the connection rod, the connecting rod, the later in the cycle that it reaches peak piston velocity. That means that the demand on the intake valve occurs later, and therefore it's further open. Now you can make about a 2-degree change in the point of peak demand by going to a 6-inch rod. You have to have a special piston, but so what that means is if it's 2 degrees later, that valve is about 8 thousandths further open at that point. Now maybe 12. So it allows the engine to breathe slightly better in the first instance. And secondly, peak piston speed for any given RPM is reduced. So the peak demand on the valve is reduced. Third thing is, it cuts friction in the engine. The side loading on the piston is reduced. So the longer connecting rod is useful in those respects. That you get the reduced friction, better VE, and that just adds up to more horsepower. It's only a small amount, but if you're out there trying to get every last ounce out of the engine, then it's significant. I mean, we're talking about 2 horsepower on a 1293. Of course, if you're going to go to have all the trouble of having another rod made, then it makes sense to not even bother with steel rods, but to go to titanium rods, which now means that you can take even more mass off your counterbalance weight. So, that's the way to go on there. So going to the lighter, longer titanium rod, you can actually see a measurable benefit in terms of power. Just putting a simple baffle, I don't know how many of you do this in your Minis, just putting a simple baffle tray across the top of the gears. And this can be, that expanded metal, because it's very good at stopping the oil flying up from the bottom end. The amount of windage and oil shearing that goes on loses quite a bit of horsepower. And just putting a tray across, we haven't measured it on the engine dyno, but on the chassis dyno, engines that we knew made this much horsepower on the engine dyno and that much on the chassis dyno, and that consistently showed a measurable amount more at the wheels. I mean, typically at 8,000 RPM, 3 or 4 horsepower. So for a simple tray across there, it was cheap power. If you're dealing just with maximum horsepower, then airflow for airflow, the Reese carburetor will make more horsepower. And the reason for that is that it produces bigger fuel droplets. And for some reason or another, the A-series engine prefers larger fuel droplets. I would like to tie this in with a question that I was asked the other night. Somebody wanted to put fuel injection on their Mini. And I said, it'll make the engine show better brake specifics, but it'll show less horsepower and torque, which surprised them. Now, the SU carburetor atomizes the fuel very well, and it's too fine for maximum power on a Mini. The best fuel droplet size is delivered by a Weber. Now, I don't know what that droplet size is. I mean, we've photographed down there using a strobe triggered off #1 cylinder, but it's very subjective looking at photographs and trying to decide how big the droplets are. But going from a Weber to a Dell'Orto, which atomizes finer, on a typical 1293S race engine, it costs about 4 horsepower. And then going to Lucas injection, high pressure injection, costs about 12 horsepower over the Weber. And it's not a question of airflow, because we've run the injectors in the side of a Weber body. So all the airflow characteristics are the same. So it's the fuel injection that's causing the problem. It's the atomization. So the Reese fish works in terms of flat-out horsepower. They don't flow as much air size to size as the SU, though, so you need to be aware of that. But as for using it on the street, I wouldn't do it. I'd stick with the SU. It's a more refined carburetor. If you're setting up a single SU, don't worry about finding the right needle. If you can get onto a chassis dyno, all you do is you start off with a needle that's too weak. That's one that's too big. And look to see where it needs riching up, and then just pull a needle out and with a fine file it. You don't have to make 2 of them. So it doesn't matter. All that you're interested in is not the size of the needle, but the ratio of the fuel and air. And doing it that way is as good a way as any. It doesn't have to be round or anything like that. That's too complicated for me. I just file it. That's why when people call me up and say, "What needle do you use?" I say, they're all DB specials. I mean, what it started off as doesn't matter. And I really don't know what it equals. And I'd be reluctant to say, even if it was a needle that I pulled right off the shelf, because all it would do is probably misguide other people into thinking that their engine needed the same, and it more than likely didn't. The chances of 2 Mini engines going together with exactly the same spec are about as good as you winning. Do you have lotteries over here? Yeah. About as good as you winning it 3 times in a row. Firstly, I see you're very anxious and even disappointed by the fact that you're now going to unleaded fuel, which in the case of a Mini can be an advantage. And I'll tell you why. Earlier on we talked about combustion speed. Leaded fuels burn slower than unleaded fuels. If you can watch what goes on in a cylinder at the point of combustion, you find that the spark happens, and then there's a little bit of activity, very small kind of kernel of flame, that for a moment doesn't seem to do anything. Well, in terms of how long a cylinder goes over, it's a long time when it doesn't actually do anything, probably as much as 10 degrees of crank rotation. It just kind of hangs around, and sometimes it detaches itself, right? That period is called the ignition delay time. It's a bit of a misnomer because ignition has happened, but it really should be the expansion delay time. Leaded gasolines have a longer expansion delay time. If you change from leaded fuels to unleaded fuels, you can get faster combustion. And for a Mini, that's good. However, what isn't good is the reduction in octane. But one of them can slightly cancel out the other. Now, in terms of the protection of the exhaust seat, a hardened seat fixes a problem, right? I don't want to keep plugging it, but those hardened seats we've got, they'll outlive the rest of your engine at least 2 to 1. We've had them out there now for 7 years, and we've had heads back that have done 50,000 miles. And the guys want them refurbished, decarbonized and that. And they don't have any wear on them. So they're going to be good for 150,000 miles, and most Minis don't do that kind of mileage. So the second thing is the bronze valve guides. A bronze valve guide has actually got a power advantage over an iron one. Because it conducts the heat away from the exhaust valve faster, it reduces exhaust valve temperature. Assuming you've got the right heat range of spark plug in the cylinder, the hottest part of the cylinder is the exhaust valve. So that is what ultimately determines whether that cylinder detonates. Assuming we don't have a problem like our friend over here, which is possibly a hot spotting cylinder head. So when you go to those bronze guides, that will be about the same as adding an octane number to that 92 octane fuel. So right now you've closed it from 4 numbers different to 3. The fact that it will burn faster means that your engine thinks that it's a higher octane. Part of the detonation, the phenomenon of detonation, is due to how long the unburnt gases are exposed to the advancing flame front. For instance, if you add toluene to a fuel, it burns faster. And although the measured octane on a CFR engine may have only gone up 2 points, your engine may react as if it's gone up 4. Your unleaded gasoline on a CFR engine may have that 92 octane. But if you keep the temperature down on it and then time the ignition right, it won't act as if it's 92. I would say that in your instance there, it's probably going to run like it's 94 octane, so you're not much different. And your engine probably will make very close to the same power output. So it isn't the big disadvantage you think it is. A lot of people get the compression on their engine going the wrong way about it. One of the things you need to do is build your engine so that the squish area meets the piston as closely as possible. Detonation usually occurs in a mini engine when you have crevices around 1/10 of an inch. Now if you've got a 20 thousandths or 30 thousandths deck clearance, detonation is going to happen usually when the piston's about 40 degrees after TDC. So it's gone down the bore about 40 thousandths, 50 thousandths. You can see that that gap's now getting close to 1/10 of an inch. At 1/10 of an inch, that is enough for it to be able to burn down it. If it's tighter than that, literally the cold surfaces of the piston and the chamber quench out the flame, so it won't detonate, but it burns very badly. So what you need to do is to make sure that combustion is completed before that gap gets to that 1/10 of an inch or thereabouts. And the first thing to do is to make sure that your pistons come at least to the top of the block. Now on my own engines when I build them, I have them 5 out. But I don't advise you to do that unless you know your combination of parts. Because if you use too much piston clearance and there's too much rock, the piston could hit. And I use very tight fitting or close fitting pistons that don't rock very much, and I can get away with 5 out and still know I've got a 5 thousandths margin. But even by doing that, you'll allow your engine to be able to deal with a higher compression. I mean, it may detonate at 9 to 1, but then you deck the block and take it up to 9.5. But now, because that quench area is working, it won't detonate at 9.5. So that's something you need to do. Whenever you build that short block, before you ever put the head on, make sure those pistons come flush to the top of the block. I'd be at least 10 engines worse off if it went for water injection. the nice thing about water is, and a lot of people don't appreciate this, but it doesn't take much thought to realize that it has infinite octane value. You ever tried setting fire to water? Right? It doesn't detonate whatever the compression, and you know, you can use some ridiculous boost figures in compression. I remember at college we did a 17-to-1 compression ratio TVO tractor engine. Right, well, TVO's got an octane value of, I don't know, about 50. We ran 17-to-1 compression, and we just put enough water into it to stop it detonating. I mean, it blew more steam out of the exhaust than the smoke, but it didn't detonate. And the other thing is this engine went for a whole year of students fooling around with it, and when it was torn down, it didn't have any carbon in it at all. It had all been steam cleaned. It was just like brand new. Now, I have seen some snags to water injection. A friend of mine and I did an engine. It was a turbocharged small block Chevy engine. And we used water injection on that because we were using about 35 pounds of boost in it. And it had a big intercooler on, but with it all running through one turbo, and then the charge got quite hot. So we ran water injection, and it worked fine, but after about 20,000 miles on this engine, there was a need to take it. Oh, I know what it was doing. It was starting to burn oil. So we took the engine apart, and much to our amazement, there was this huge amounts of steam erosion had taken place in the squish area on the heads. I mean, so much so that it scrapped the cylinder heads. I mean, it must have eroded 1/4 of an inch off them. Now, that's the worst case I've ever seen, but if you do put too much water in an engine, that can happen. Usually we set the water injection up on the dyno, and we just run the engine up. If we hear detonation, we just put more in. And we've just put enough in to fix the detonation. Now I know that there's several, let me see, I think in Ricardo's book, he's got quite a bit on the ratio of water to fuel for different compression and boost pressures. I don't remember what those figures are, but I'd say on about a 13-to-1 motor, you'd be, in a relatively short cam, you'd be looking at about 40% of the water to fuel, about. But there again, we've had nitrous engines where we've put a lot of water in, where we've put in more water than there is fuel going in. So it's highly variable. Everything from screen washer bottles to screen washer pumps to using the pressure, supercharged pressure to push it in. But screen washer pumps work really well. I mean, most of them will make 45 psi, and they're cheap. That especially appeals to me. They're cheap.